This panel is going to be focused primarily around a lot of the housing barriers that face individuals after incarceration. A recent study found that after incarceration, individuals are 10 times more likely to be homeless than the general population. And this is something that through my work at Inside Out I see quite frequently. The barriers to accessing housing are extremely high. Landlords are often very hard to convince that they should rent to someone with a criminal background. And so this session is going to focus on highlighting some of those challenges, as well as talking about some of the efforts that are going on in our community to mitigate them. So we have one of our panelists is Ericka Peterson. She currently teaches and supervises law students in the Health Justice Law Clinic at Georgetown University Law Center. The clinic provides poverty law advocacy through a medical legal partnership between the law school and the medical school. And she's also a former Iowa legal aid attorney and Iowa native. So we're glad that she came back to visit Iowa. And we've got Rachel Lehman here, who is the Rapid Rehousing Program Manager at Shelter House. She's really passionate about providing trauma-informed services for those experiencing homelessness. And if you aren't aware, Shelter House runs a 70-bed shelter facility here in Iowa City, and as well as having 3 homes through which they provide permanent supportive housing. So we're going to start with a presentation from Ericka.
So yes, we're talking about barriers to housing for reentering citizens. Just sort of a roadmap of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm just going to give you some basic background information on affordable housing, the affordable housing crisis in the United States, which we're impacted here in Iowa by as well. I'll give you some stats on reentering citizens' ability to get housing. And then I'm going to go through what I think are the 3 biggest barriers for housing. I think there's probably more, and there's also some solutions that are unrelated to some of the stuff I'm talking about today, but I think this covers sort of the big ones. And then talk a little bit about solutions. So, next slide, please. So, at the start, I think a starting point is, why does housing matter? It's sort of obvious, right? It's almost so obvious it's difficult to articulate, I think. But it's actually, there's a lot of robust research on why housing matters. And so for those of you that have read Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, his quote is, without a home, everything else falls apart. For those of you that haven't read it, it's an excellent read, and I highly recommend it. But basically, what we know is that if you lack stable housing, you have an increased risk of chronic illness, infectious disease, physical and sexual assaults, feelings of loss of dignity, distress, anxiety, depression, and death. A person who is homeless is 3 to 4 times more likely to die than the general population. It also causes the loss of jobs and leads to job insecurity. And for kids, because let's not forget that a lot of times the people that are reentering are raising a family. For kids, there's loss of academic achievement, developmental delay, and then also some of the same mental health issues that adults have, so anxiety, depression. And also, when people are forced to move, so for example, if a loved one is incarcerated and they can no longer afford rent, forced moves destabilize the community, right? Because you have someone that probably is invested in their neighborhood, their street, suddenly gone. And that and usually it's not replaced with a person that cares as much, or they move to a place they don't want to invest in because it's seen as a temporary move. And so it creates a lot of destabilization in the community more broadly. And I also think it's important to point out, and I think you'll probably see throughout the presentation, the sort of cyclical nature of a lot of this and how interconnected many of the issues are. But that homelessness leads to increased contact with the criminal justice system in the first place. 9% of adult, state, and federal inmates reported an episode of homelessness in the year prior to their arrest. And that's 4 to 6 times the estimated general U.S. adult population. So there's a connection there, and I think it's a really important one. So, with all of this in mind, it doesn't take a lot of mental gymnastics to realize that obviously stable housing is super important for people coming back into their communities. Here's just some quick stats on it. These are just some small studies that were done, but based on these individual studies, those who received supportive housing were 61% likely to be reincarcerated within the year. People with criminal records who lived on the street were shown to have been arrested at double the rate of their counterparts. And in one study, people released from prison and jail to parole who entered homeless shelters in New York City were 7 times more likely to abscond during the first month after release than those who had some form of housing. So I think those stats are pretty powerful. I don't think we need to talk a lot about it because I think it's obvious, right? Like, stable housing is the root of everything, and if you don't have that, how are you supposed to thrive? I would also, though, note that unsurprisingly, the research also shows that stable housing is also critical for people with who are struggling with chemical dependency or addiction. Is a critical piece to overcoming that. So yeah. And some of the stats on what it actually looks like for people who are trying to get into housing, 79% of participants in a survey done were either ineligible for or denied housing because of their own conviction or that of a loved one. I think the stat right now is I think the FBI estimates that 1 in 4 Americans have a criminal record of some sort. So it's an astounding number of people that find barriers to housing because of a criminal record. And then the other one is that 1 in 10 survey participants reported family members being evicted when loved ones returned. So this is something as a legal aid attorney that I saw not infrequently, but especially if a family has subsidized housing, so that's like a Section 8 voucher or public housing, and mom and 2 kids are living there, dad's been incarcerated, dad comes back home and wants to reunite with his family, not a surprising thing, and can't live in the subsidized housing because of his criminal record. So the family's choice is then to go to housing that they cannot afford or live separately from their father, which I think the policy there is it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever if the goal is to get people back into the community and thrive. So, I think to sort of center us on what the barriers are, I think it's important to understand a little bit of the background on affordable housing generally in the United States. Probably many of you have heard about the affordable housing crisis, but what does that mean? And what it basically means is that extremely low-income renters, which makes up about 25% of all renters, there is a shortage of housing. I think it's 7.1 million too few units in the United States. Basically, that means there's about 33 available, safe, decent housing units for every 100 people that need them. And so a huge problem and part of the barrier for all individuals in that category, but included in that is reentering citizens, is that there simply aren't enough affordable units available. And that's a huge problem. So basically what happens then is people end up paying more than they should for rent. Our sort of gold standard in the United States is that we pay 30% of our income towards housing. That is a little bit different for the much higher income categories, but certainly in that extreme low income, the ideal is 30%. And the reason is that way you can afford your other basic necessities. And unfortunately, most people in this category are paying 50 to 70% of their income on rent. And what happens then is they have to make excruciating choices like, should I get medical care for my kid this week or this month? Or is my kid going to be able to eat as much as they should? And there's actually a lot of studies that kids are not getting the nutrition they need because too much of their money is going towards rent. And there's a lot of studies that show that lack of nutrition hurts academic achievement, leads to more contact with the criminal justice system. So it's all very cyclical and problematic. And basically, families are one emergency away from not being able to afford rent. So I think that's sort of important because that's sort of the background of why housing is problematic even without a criminal record and how it gets more complicated with a criminal record. Just as some background for here in Iowa, Basically, you need to work 85 hours per week if you're making minimum wage in order to afford a 2-bedroom unit. I don't know about you guys, but 85 hours a week seems challenging, particularly if you're trying to raise a family or sleep occasionally. So that's sort of the really clear numbers on why this is really problematic. So go ahead here. So barrier number one that I've sort of identified is a pretty obvious one within the affordable housing crisis, and the inability to afford rent. Low-income individuals are more likely to be incarcerated in the first place. So usually when a reentering citizen comes out of prison or jail, they don't have, a bank account that's just chock full of money that they can then go and, spend for a while before they get some stability. They're likely not to have connections so that they can get a job very quickly. So that's part of the problem. Incarceration is also incredibly expensive. Often this falls on the family members, but there's costs for your attorney's fees, court costs, fines. Some places charge you by the day for the time you were in jail. And so all of that, you're having to come back re-entering and pay all of this debt as well. And so that's even more hard on having enough money to afford rent. And then finally, a major issue is finding employment after incarceration. One survey showed that 76% of formerly incarcerated individuals rated finding work as very difficult to nearly impossible. And there's I don't have to read it here, but research has found upwards of 60% of formerly incarcerated individuals are still unemployed after 1 year. And so this is a huge part of this housing barrier. You can't overlook the employment aspect of this when you're thinking about housing, because this policy is critical, or policies related to employment are critical to people being able to access housing. When people are able to get employed, often it's low-wage jobs. And if you think back to the page before, you got to be working 85 hours if you can manage minimum wage. Often people might be working under the table, so they're maybe not even making minimum wage. And even if they're making enough money to afford a unit, if they're working under the table or they're working odd jobs, they may not be able to prove up that they're making that income, and then a landlord won't accept them based on just their lack of ability to prove the income. Another issue that a lot of low-income individuals and certainly reentering citizens find is a lack of credit or bad credit. And landlords, even if you've got the income you need, if you don't have the credit, that will be a reason that a landlord would deny your application. It's also a reason that's legal when the real reasoning may not be legal. So there's certainly discrimination based on race, income, that maybe if you're using a voucher, there's discrimination happening that's illegal, and then there's discrimination happening that's not illegal, and so they may use credit as a basis to actually keep certain individuals that they deem not worthy of housing out. The one other note I will make on this is that if you can't afford housing or you're having difficulty finding housing, you usually end up, if you can get any sort of housing, in poor substandard conditions, frankly with slumlords often. And some of those things that we talked about in the beginning about what impacts that it has for not having shelter, those same things apply when you're living in substandard conditions. So the things I'm thinking about here are lead, mold, rodents, insect infestations. And these things have huge impacts on physical health. Lead can permanent neurological damage in children. There actually is some correlation between criminal outcomes and lead poisoning in childhood. Mold, the rodents all exacerbate asthma. So there's all of these things are really, really important, and often if you can't afford your housing, you end up in substandard conditions. I can't not make a note of that because I see it all too often in the work that I do. So as I discussed, obviously one huge barrier is the ability to get income. When you leave prison, often you're not able to get income like through food stamps or other government programs, so then you need to be able to work. There are very few legal protections to help individuals with criminal records. There's actually lots of laws banning people from working in entire industries. Most of the laws are working to protect and keep people out of employment. That is changing a little bit. I think there is some movement there. And so I just wanted to touch briefly on that. There's no federal prohibition on discriminating against those with criminal records, but there are some tax credits available sometimes for those that help reentering citizens find employ them at their whatever business they have. And then there's also, the good news is that 3/4 of Americans are now covered by ban the box laws. That's obviously, I think, pretty hot here in Iowa right now, as Waterloo just passed the state's first full ban the box law. So Lynn County and Johnson County have a ban the box for government employees, but the Waterloo law would actually enforce it on private employers as well. And so the research, because there's been it's a controversial law. The research, there's actually a law review article from the University of Iowa from this year, and the research shows that it does help individuals get access to employment. And the important point to note with this is that it means that when you're filling out the application, there's no box saying, yes, I have a criminal record. Because what happens is you check that box, and then employees have a bunch of applications, and they just throw those in the trash, right? But the research shows when people actually are able to meet and tell their story, they're much more likely to gain access to employment because, I mean, sort of generally, when we talk to people face to face, we realize we're all humans and can sort of relate better. And so the outcomes are better, even though an employer ultimately can run a background check and can decide to keep the person from working there if they decide whatever is on their background is not good. It's not saying that no employer can ever know their employee's criminal background. It's just stopping it at that very first line. So yeah, I think that's really critically connected to that first barrier. So the second barrier that I've identified here is the denial of housing subsidies. For those of you that are less familiar, the housing subsidies I'm thinking or talking about are what I already mentioned was public housing, Section 8 vouchers. Those are all federally subsidized programs that help people afford rent. And the idea is going back to that 30% of rent, you pay, or 30% of your income. With those subsidies, the idea is that you pay 30% of your income towards housing. So whatever your income is, you're paying 30% of it. And the government, through local and federal funding, is helping subsidize the rest. These programs are incredibly important for low-income Americans, and they've been underfunded for decades. So about 1 in 4 of those who are economically eligible, income eligible, only 1 in 4 Americans has access to them. The way that this plays out then is we create a deserving poor dynamic, right? And so we have lots of rules keeping people out. And one of those rules historically has been a criminal record. So federal, and this can get really complicated because the way that it works is that the federal government has written the statute about what these programs are going to look like. And then the federal agency, Housing and Urban Development, writes regulations about what it's going to look like. And then all the local housing authorities, so here we have an Iowa City Housing Authority, there's a housing authority in Cedar Rapids. The Iowa City one covers Iowa City, a little bit of Washington County, and a little bit of Cedar County, I think. And then Cedar Rapids covers Benton and Lynn counties. So they cover a regional area, and then they make up their own rules too. So there's lots and lots of layers of rules. Back in the 90s, when we were full in on the war on drugs, what we basically did as a country is decide that, you do anything related to drugs on near public housing property and you're out. We had very strict limits. I don't have to tell you how that played out. It played out in a racially diverse way. divisive way. You heard about the stories of like grandma losing her public housing that she'd been in for 20 years because her granddaughter smoked marijuana down the block. And so these really ugly laws that are still lingering in the books today. During the Obama administration, the HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, created some guidance that said, hey, housing authorities, the law actually says you have discretion here. Discretion means you don't have to kick people out or deny people because 17 years ago they stole something from Walgreens, because that was literally what was happening. And so right now today, there's two things that under federal law you cannot get housing subsidies for, and that's if you're on a sex offender registry or you have manufactured methamphetamine in a public housing unit. Other than that, local housing authorities have discretion that they don't use. I think some local authorities are using it more, others less. Iowa City looks back at records for 5 years. Cedar Rapids looks back at records for 3 years. And they have the ability then to have a more robust conversation, and on a case-by-case basis will reconsider. In practice, personally, and I don't know if Rachel can speak more to this, they don't look case by case, they just reject. And it's because they have years-long wait lists, and it's easier to just toss out and put other people in because the wait lists are so long. So I don't know if you can tell, but I'm rather passionate about this issue, and I get a little snarky with it. But the good news is there is some change going on slowly and painfully. The maybe biggest change is that the House this year, there's a bill proposed called the Fair Chance at Housing Act of 2019. And that was, I think, Kamala Harris and I forget the House member. They put this bill up, and it would basically loosen some of these restrictions and not only allow the local housing authorities discretion on criminal background, but actually require them to consider people with criminal backgrounds, which would be really great news because, again, these are such critical programs for people being able to access safe housing, and when you allow people to access safe housing, they actually often get off of the programs because they're eventually able to thrive. Or if they're not, who cares, because then they have housing, but that's just me. Okay, the third barrier is refusal to rent. Obviously, this is sort of the mega one, right? 79% of those with criminal records have been denied housing because of that criminal record. Some of this is sort of just basic, sort of ingrained in our cultural thought that, oh my God, if someone has a criminal record, they're gonna come to my rental unit and my neighbors are gonna be mad at me, or the community is gonna be mad at me, or they're probably gonna commit more crimes, and this is gonna be terrible, and so I'm just not going to rent to people with criminal backgrounds. The research does not provide any indication that that's actually what would happen if you rented to people with criminal backgrounds, but that's sort of the cultural mentality. The other problem is that landlords use background checks, and the people that are actually doing it don't understand it. So here in Iowa, we have access to Iowa Courts Online, and you can look up anyone you want's criminal background or any court cases they have, and we would run into this all the time, that they would see someone was charged with something, and that's good enough as a conviction, which is sort of, against everything we think of as Americans, right? Innocent until proven guilty. But because they were charged with something and landlords aren't understanding that, what that means or where it is in the process, the people are out. There's also a lot of misinformation out there, so depending on which organization they're using to run a larger background check, there's mistakes all over the place. And proving that you didn't do a thing that is suddenly on this internet database is actually really, really difficult. And we did that a couple times at Legal Aid, and you basically need a lawyer to do it. So the other problem with private landlords is they have discretion to basically do what they want within reason, right? As long as they don't tell you, I'm actually not renting to you because of the color of your skin, it's really, really difficult to prove that. And so they can look back for 99 years on your criminal record, and they don't have to tell you why they made that decision, and then you don't have any basis to challenge it. There's no like court you can go to say like, my landlord, if you knew me, I'm actually a really great tenant, in the way that you might be able to with the federal housing subsidies. So that creates a problem. It also, I just want to make a note, this is a really costly process for tenants. So I've actually seen where landlords know they're not going to rent to someone, but they have them file the application fee and make a couple bucks off of it. So, it's $25, $50 to run this background check. This landlord is never going to rent to you when they know that you've got like a felony on your background record, but they'll let you go through the process anyway. And even if they don't know that, it's very, very expensive to go place to place to place just trying to get the application, let alone if you could ever rent it. This is all exacerbated by something we call crime-free and nuisance property ordinances. This is a really big deal in Cedar Rapids, less so, I think, I'll be interested to hear what you say, Rachel, in Iowa City. But these are, there's estimated 2,000 local municipalities and 44 states that have these laws. And basically, these laws attempt to make the landlord accountable for criminal activity on their property. So some laws require landlords to evict if a crime happens on their property. Some laws charge landlords fines. So in Cedar Rapids, if some sort of, even a minor nuisance happens, so say garbage is left out on the porch for a week or whatever it is, that can cause a landlord to incur fines. So landlord's response to that is to run criminal background checks and not rent to people that have criminal backgrounds because they think that that means they're going to commit more crimes and then they're going to get fined for the crime happening on their property. These laws became incredibly controversial in Iowa because what was happening is people that who were victims of crime, especially domestic abuse victims, were calling the police and then getting eviction notices for nuisances. So actually under the Branstad administration in 2015, Iowa did pass a right to assistance bill that sort of limited the ability of some of these ordinances to do that, which is good because domestic abuse victims end up being homeless at high rates anyway. So this is a problem, but it doesn't fix it for reentering citizens. And I will tell you, I saw one when I was a legal aid attorney. It was a man who had suffered from really severe mental illness his entire life. He was bipolar, and he walked in my office and he's like, I have not had any problems in 4 years. My doctor finally found out the medication that really works for me, but I can't rent anywhere because of this very extensive criminal history, which was mostly pretty petty stuff, but it was extensive. And for months and months, we could not get this guy into housing. We had connections with the people in Cedar Rapids who supposedly, in these special circumstances, helped with this silly law that really doesn't actually hurt people, it just keeps people safe. And we just could not get him into housing, even with their help. So I've seen this play out on the individual level, and it was one of those cases where I sat up in the night being like, this makes no sense, and all people should have access to housing. But that one sticks with me. It does happen to people time and time again, and these laws exacerbate this problem that already exists with landlords not wanting to rent to people with criminal backgrounds. It's also, I think, really, really important to note that this is a new way to maintain residential segregation. If you haven't seen this amazing documentary called Race, the Power of Illusion, The House We Live In, it's a really great history on redlining in the United States. And I think this just plays right back into some of that. If you don't know what redlining is basically the federal government saying these people get loans, these people don't, and it was based on race. And it set us up for years of not having equality in the amount of income we have. So this is playing out that way as well, because we know that people of color are disproportionately charged and convicted with crimes in this country, the state of Iowa being one of the worst offenders. I think we've dropped to number 2 from number 1 now. I'm not proud of that, but but the point being is that what then happens is that we have racial segregation in neighborhoods because of laws like this. And so that brings me to some uplifting but then not uplifting news. So disparate impact is a tool that we can use to fight some of this discrimination. The concept of disparate impact is basically when we create laws that harm groups of people. So African Americans are getting credit at different rates than white people, even though they have the same credit history. Something's wrong here, but we can't find the intent, because generally with discrimination, you have to prove intent to discriminate, which can be very, very difficult. Disparate impact can be used as a tool to overcome that intent, because whether the intent is there or not, what the law is doing is impacting people of color. It's impacting women. And so we can use this as a tool to challenge, for example, the nuisance laws, and that has been used successfully in some places in the United States. It can also be used for, you imagine large corporate landlords who don't accept anyone, they don't accept any tenants who have a credit score under 600. Those have been used. Disparate impact has been used as to challenge that as well. So it's a very useful and important tool to combat some of the impacts of these laws. Unfortunately, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, has now proposed a rule which would make it extremely difficult, basically would make this disparate impact tool obsolete. And as it so happens, the deadline to comment on this rule is today. So if I actually brought some flyers if anyone is interested, but they're looking for as many people as possible to make comments on why this is not a great rule. And a couple of organizations got together and have a fabulous flyer on how this impacts jeopardizes fair chance housing for people with arrest and conviction records. So the hashtag is Fight for Housing Justice, and you can find a whole bunch of resources online if you're interested in writing something about that. And if anyone's interested, those are just some resources that I think were very useful. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to turn it over to Rachel so she can tell us a little bit about the work at Shelter House and what they're doing to sort of mitigate some of these barriers that we've heard about, as well as some of the really progressive and exciting projects that your organization has been doing.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, great. Thank you so much for all of that data and wonderful information. I can say it pretty accurately reflects the community that we live in terms of housing discrimination and barriers for folks who are returning citizens into our community. Shelter House has a wide variety of programs that we address homelessness in particular. We believe housing is a human right. So straight up, everything that we do and operate from is from that principle. The more national language for that is housing first. So what that means is, if everybody knows what Maslow's hierarchy of needs is, you can't do anything without a stable place to live, food to eat, and some measurable amount of safety. So what we do is try and find housing for folks immediately. So we have a 70-bed shelter. We have a winter emergency shelter that operates for a few months during the winter months. But really what we're trying to do with those folks is get them into housing as quickly as possible without any preconditions. So we don't care if you have a job. We don't care if you are actively using substances. We don't care if you are totally incapable of functioning in present-day society. We want to get you into that stable place as quickly as possible. Now, do landlords agree with that? No, they don't. And I think the data that was so wonderfully presented today really reflects that. And so part of what our job to do is really build relationships in the community with landlords to understand and educate what it means to not have a home. And that has been quite a challenge, but honestly, we do have slumlords in this community, but we also have really amazing people who own property and are business owners and want to help people move forward in their lives. So I need to give a shout out to those folks, because we couldn't house 400 people a year without without them. And so part of what we recognize in those situations is they're a business owner. They are trying to make money to support their own families and in their own lives. And we have the same goal. The same goal is that we want people to live in their housing, and they want people to live in their housing. We just have to really create a conversation and understanding of, why do you want this person to live in your housing? And so when we're talking about folks who are returning from incarceration, that can be a real challenge, because really it's just misinformation. Part of what we talk about when we're advocating for somebody is kind of what they're doing now. What are the things that they're focusing on in their life that really are totally different from the charge that they may have had to serve time for? But when you're talking about barriers, right, part of what a landlord wants to know is, do you have money? And when you are a returning citizen, your access to employment, as we've learned today, is pretty much really awful. And so when I have a case manager who's working with somebody who's making $9 an hour at a fast food restaurant, and a one-bedroom apartment in this community is going for $775, how are we to convince that landlord that that person can actually maintain that housing? Our Section 8 wait list, housing choice voucher, as it is now called, is extremely long. It's a good 2 years. Honestly, we will apply with everybody who comes through our agency, but it's not something we're going to count on. So then what happens is, because we have these screenings of credit, right? So if you're a returning citizen, the likelihood of you having a 650 credit score is 0. We have criminal history, but also rental history. If you've been incarcerated, you don't have a rental history, and you're not going to put down Oakdale's address as the place that you lived. You're not going to do that. Some people don't even want to put our address down if they're staying in the shelter, because there is an additional stigma for those experiencing homelessness on top of having criminal charges in your background. So it's really that education piece, and why these kinds of events are so important, to really talk about who the folks that we are serving are and what it is they have going on in their lives. I heard a quote once from Ian DeJong. He's a leader in homeless services. People don't experience homelessness when they run out of money. They experience homelessness when they run out of relationships. And so what I love about our community and what Inside Out does and shelters, we try and get people back into community, and that starts with housing. So the other thing I wanted to reference, which we were going to talk briefly about, how are we doing on time? We're good. Okay. We recently opened up a 24 one-bedroom unit building called Cross Park Place. This is a housing first project designed for folks who experienced chronic homelessness, but were also frequent users of systems. So hospital, jail, mental health, substance use. And prior to opening up this facility, there was a study done over 4 years, it was 4 years, 2010 to 2014, of 4 individuals. Those 4 people cost Johnson County alone $2.1 million in and out of jail, in and out of the hospital, in and out of substance use treatment, $2.1 million. And so when we look at partnering to end that experience for those individuals, providing that housing at a really super cheap price, not cheap, but not $2.1 million, right? We saw a 60% reduction in cost for those individuals who have now moved into those units. Additionally, the 4 individuals that we did that study on, 2 of them passed away on the street. So we don't have much data yet. It opened in January of this year, so I don't have any follow-up data to share with you, unfortunately, on that. But that has been really wonderful, because a lot of those folks who have criminal charges basically from experiencing homelessness, whether it's trespass or, trying to find a place to sleep and getting kicked out constantly, those folks now have a place to live, which has been fantastic. Another one of our permanent supportive housing projects called the Fairweather Lodge. That is for folks who experience pretty persistent homelessness. I wouldn't say they meet the definition of chronic by HUD, which is pretty specific, but persistent homelessness and suffer from pretty severe mental illness. And over 1 year, the participants of that program saw a 99.9% reduction in jail night stays. So that's something that, you know, when we're talking about housing first, I don't have any other way to explain to you with that kind of percentage rate on how successful it's been. The last thing I wanted to touch on, are we doing on time? We're okay? Okay. The last thing I want to touch on most importantly, and I think that we often forget about, is folks with disabilities. You have individuals in the community who have a pretty severe disability and are just totally unable to work. And they will receive 771 in the form of Social Security income from the government every single month as a means to support themselves. And often what we see, those individuals also have every other barrier in their experience of criminal background, credit, no rental history, homelessness. And trying to find housing for those folks is almost nearly impossible. I once worked with a man who served 10 years in prison and came out directly to homelessness. He was paralyzed from the waist down, severe chronic physical health issues. We contacted 68 landlords in this community, 68, and not one, A, had a wheelchair accessible unit, or B, even remotely affordable. We found one, I think, for $1,100 a month, and he made $771. So when we're looking at housing folks in this community, it's really, really tough, and that's why affordable housing is so important, and really, quite frankly, more permanent supportive housing, based upon the data that we've seen, is needed. So, thanks.
Okay, so we're running a little bit out of time, but I wanted to point out there's a study that came out this year, was done in the Twin Cities area, and it's the first one that I've seen that's really looked at does criminal background actually impact your ability to be successful in a rental unit. They looked at 10,000 households from 2010 to 2017, and they looked at 15 different categories of crime, and they actually found that there were only 4 categories that had any impact at all, and it was only by 4 to 9 percentage points. So statistically significant, but that's still quite small when you really think about the grand scheme of things. And also that the significance of the conviction, there was no impact at all after 5 years or 2 years for a misdemeanor. And there's so many background checks in our community that are going back 7 or 10 years that we see all the time. And there's literally no research that I've seen that even remotely supports that. And so, I'm hoping that, if there are folks in this room that know landlords, if you have those connections, a lot of times it's the best progress we can make is through the conversations. It's through changing minds. And I know that's how we've found 2 landlords that we've worked with at Inside Out, is through volunteers or supporters talking to their friends and saying, hey, would you give this a shot? Would you, consider talking to this person or renting to them? And, as Ericka said, when someone can actually have that conversation and talk to the person, that a lot of those barriers can be reduced, but it's getting to that point and being able to address that face-to-face. I think we have time for about one question, if anyone would like to answer anything. Yes.
Hi. Okay. Hi. My question is about landlords and housing. I spent 6 years incarcerated. I'm also a landlord. I have a couple of rental properties in LeClaire. It's a nice little neighborhood. And I'm wondering, because, I understand people come out of prison and they're facing challenges, but I'm wondering why in the world you would think I would want to rent to an unemployed person who's still on drugs. I just had my house destroyed by somebody who works in social services. Did close to $10,000 worth of damage. I think she was a better bet. You know, if I rent to somebody that's still on drugs and doesn't have a job, who's going to pay for the damage to the house? Who's going to pay for the rent when they don't pay it because they don't have a job? And this is a really serious question, because I want to help. I don't want to be part of the problem, but I don't want to screw myself in the process.
I'd say actually a lot of what we see with barriers with landlords is these are individuals that are employed, that have income, and even having the income is not influencing them at all. You know, folks going and saying, you know, this is even, you know, this is what I'm getting, Social Security, this is the income that I'm getting, and the landlord is still saying, no, we don't care. I was trying to help someone who was a journeyman carpenter who was making substantially more money than I make as a social worker, I will say, and he was having challenges finding housing because of the incarceration. So I totally understand what you're saying, but a lot of the barriers that we're seeing with landlords, it's not folks that are, you know, completely unemployed. It's they're gainfully employed, they're making money, they have some of these community supports, and they're just looking right at that background and saying no.
I think I'd like to add to our community's been working pretty, we're hoping in 2020 to start what's called risk mitigation. So if you have a person who is risky to a landlord and might appear risky on an application, right? Everything you put on an apartment application is everything bad about you. Like, oh, my credits, you know, sucks. But like, actually you hear those really amazing things from me. It's not like a resume. You can't like say how great you are, right? So in your case, you have this person who maybe on paper seemed like they could function well in the apartment, clear having other challenges. But what risk mitigation does is kind of an insurance fund for folks who seem riskier. So basically communities will get a pot of money together and they will insure that tenant above and beyond the security deposit. So our goal is to, in the next year, insure 10 folks who seem very, very risky and are experiencing pretty lengthy periods of homelessness, to say to a landlord, okay, we'll pay double deposit for this person and we'll insure them up to $3,500 beyond anything for damages that may be caused while living in the unit. But I have to tell you, in any community that has ever done that, it has almost never been tapped into, because the folks who are appearing risky on paper don't often go around punching holes in walls and leaving massive amounts of damage. But what the barriers would suggest on the application in the landlord mind indicate otherwise. So, you know, I think it's tough when you get stuck with that big bill. Why would you want to consider renting to someone who may have even a hint of those problems in their past? And that's kind of where that education piece for us comes, in getting to know folks and helping them.
Well, you specifically mentioned getting people with no jobs into houses and those
Yeah.
that come with the landlords.
Yeah, that is very confusing for people. But so there's no way, it's really, really challenging to have a job when you don't have a place to put your body when you're done working that job. And if I had to leave this place and go crawl under a bridge and try and sleep on a mattress, you know, in very cold weather, the likelihood of me getting up and going to that job is pretty much none. That's why our program works with folks for an extended period of time, getting them back to work if they don't already have work. And whether that's supported employment or whether that's employment that's accessible to them, that's our goal. Yep.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all so much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. No, that's okay. It's fantastic. But I think we'll all be around to continue talking so much.